Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe and support me. The city loomed over Evan like a beast in slumber, every building a jagged fang in the skyline, every street a winding artery pumping with life. Neon lights flickered in the haze, casting shifting shadows over the narrow alleyways where crime thrived, unnoticed by the wealthy above. In the underbelly of the metropolis, whispers of a string of mysterious disappearances had begun to surface. To most, these were just rumors, urban legends twisted by paranoia, but to Evan, they felt like the first strands of a web wrapping around the city, tightening with each new case, and he was about to be caught right in the middle of it. It was late evening when Evan met his client, a woman whose eyes were red from crying. Her brother, just like so many others, had vanished without a trace. No leads, no ransom note, Tessa just gone. She had come to Evan in desperation, unable to trust the city's police force, who were either indifferent or quietly paid off by the shadowy organizations that controlled the city. They say it's connected to something old, she whispered as they sat in his small, dimly lit office, the scent of stale coffee filling the air. I don't know what, but I've heard people talk about a spider. Something about spiders. Evan leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing. Spiders? That's a new one. You sure they weren't talking about gangs? She shook her head, her hands trembling. It's not just street talk. It's something bigger than that. They're afraid, but they won't say why. Please, I need to know what happened to my brother. Evan nodded, scribbling notes down as the woman left. The door clicked shut, and silence fell over the office, save for the hum of the city outside. He had been chasing these strange disappearances for weeks, and the more he dug, the less he found. Each missing person left behind the same cryptic gela, an abandoned apartment, personal belongings untouched, and, in a few cases, strange symbols left behind. Symbols like webs. He had a hunch, one he didn't quite like, but it was enough to get him moving. The investigation took him deep into the heart of the city, where the walls closed in, and every alley felt like a tunnel to another world. He traced the last known location of the missing brother, a rundown bar near the district border. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and whispered deals, and the bartender barely looked up as Evan slid into a booth in the corner. "Seen the sky?" Evan asked, tossing a photograph onto the table. The bartender glanced at it, then turned away. "Nah, lots of people come through here." Evan wasn't surprised by the lack of cooperation. It was part of the game in this city. But something in the bartender's stiffened shoulders told Evan he knew more than he was letting on. Evan reached into his jacket, pulling out a few bills and placing them on the bar. The bartender's eyes flicked to the money, and after a long pause, he leaned in close. "You didn't hear it from me," he muttered, "but people like him? They've been going missing near the old cathedral, down by the waterfront. No one goes there anymore. Too many stories." "What kind of stories?" "Ones that'll get you killed if you ask too many questions." Evan pocketed the photograph and the lead. It wasn't much, but it was something. The old cathedral had been abandoned for years, long forgotten by the city's planners, and now standing as a crumbling relic, looming over the darkened waterfront like a monument to forgotten gods. The waterfront district had always been a quiet part of town, not because of its isolation but because most of its buildings were either condemned or left to rot by businesses that couldn't keep up with the demands of the city's elite. As Evan approached the cathedral, the air grew colder, and the feeling of being watched crawled over his skin. The faint sound of water lapping against the docks echoed in the silence as the wind whispered through the broken windows of the towering structure. He stepped through the crumbling doorway, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. The cathedral was eerily silent, its high ceilings casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. Pews were overturned, and the once grand altar stood broken, like the remains of a forgotten faith. But what caught Evan's eye were the symbols. They were everywhere, carved into the stone walls, scrawled in faded paint. The webs, intricate and sprawling, were more than just symbols, they were warnings, or perhaps invitations, into something far darker than he could imagine. The floorboards creaked underfoot as he moved deeper into the cathedral, his senses on high alert. That's when he saw Ida something glinting in the faint light beneath the cracked pew. Bending down, Evan picked up a small metallic charm in the shape of a spider, its legs curled inwards as if guarding something. A cold breeze swept through the room, and with it came a sound that sent a chill down his spine, a faint clicking, like the skittering of legs on stone. He turned sharply, his flashlight flickering as it caught movement in the shadows. For a moment, he thought he saw something, a figure, distorted and hunched, moving with unnatural speed across the far wall. But as quickly as it appeared, it was gone, leaving only the silence behind. Evan's pulse quickened. He knew there was something more to this case than just a missing person. Something ancient and deadly was stalking the city, and it had left its mark here in this cathedral. His instincts told him to leave, to get out before whatever it was came back. But another part of him, the part that always got him into trouble, urged him to stay, to dig deeper. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the edge of uncovering something far bigger than a simple disappearance. As he moved to leave, something else caught his eye, an old, dusty book lying open on the floor near the altar. The pages were brittle with age, but the words were clear enough. Ancient symbols, rituals, and a name. The spider god. Evan's fingers traced the faded ink as a strange sensation rippled through his body. His heart pounded in his chest, and for a brief moment, he felt an odd pressure in his hands. Glancing down, his breath caught in his throat. Thin, nearly invisible strands of silk-like webbing were stretching between his fingers, clinging to his skin. "What the hell, a broken bar," he muttered, shaking his hands. But the webbing didn't disappear. Instead, it grew stronger, more tangible. His body reacted, muscles tightening as if awakening to something long dormant. Instinctively, he reached out, and the webbing shot from his hand, attaching itself to a nearby pillar. Shocked, Evan yanked his hand back, and the webbing retracted, pulling him with it. His body moved with unnatural agility, landing lightly on the floor as if he weighed nothing. Fear and confusion warred within him, but beneath that, something else stirred, a curiosity. He didn't understand what was happening, but he knew it was connected to the case, to the cult, and to the strange symbols that had been haunting his investigation. He had to find out more. The widow was his only lead now. She was a shadow in the city's criminal underworld, a figure who trafficked in knowledge too dangerous for most to seek. Evan had worked with her before, and though he didn't trust her, he knew she might have answers. The streets blurred as Evan made his way to her hideout, his mind racing with questions. How long had he been capable of these spider-like powers? And why were they manifesting now, at the exact moment he was closing in on the cult? When he arrived at the widow's lair, an old warehouse turned fortress, she greeted him with her usual cryptic smile. "I've been expecting you, Locke," she said, her voice low and measured. "You've finally stumbled upon the truth, haven't you?" Evan didn't bother with pleasantries. "What the hell is happening to me?" She motioned for him to sit, her sharp eyes studying him. "The cult you're chasing isn't just some French group. They've been around for centuries, hidden in the shadows, pulling the strings of this city. And you," she paused, leaning forward, "you're tied to them, more than you know." The widow's words hit Evan harder than any punch he'd ever taken. "Tied to them, more than you know?" His stomach churned as she stared at him, eyes gleaming with some kind of dark knowledge. He didn't want to believe her, but the web-like strands clinging to his fingers were hard to ignore. "What do you mean, tied to them?" His voice came out sharper than he intended, a mix of fear and anger bubbling just under the surface. She chuckled softly, as if his frustration amused her. "The cult you're chasing doesn't just worship the spider god, Evan. They believe in a prophecy about someone with the power to either bring their god into this world or destroy it. You didn't just stumble into this case by accident. You were drawn to it because you're part of that prophecy." Evan felt a cold sweat forming on the back of his neck. "That's ridiculous." "Is it?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. "Look at your hands. You're not just investigating them, Locke. You're becoming them." He flexed his fingers, watching the silk-like webbing materialize again between them. His mind raced as he tried to piece everything together. The disappearances, the cult, the power. So were they connected to him in some way? Had this power always been inside him, dormant until now? The widow stood up and began rummaging through a stack of old books on a nearby table. She tossed one toward him, and he caught it, barely glancing at the cover before opening it. Inside were pages filled with ancient symbols and illustrations of spider-like beings, a half-human, half-creature, their eyes dark and empty, their hands wrapped in webs. "This is what you're up against," she said. "The spider god is more than a myth. It's real, and its followers are preparing for a summoning ritual. That's what all these disappearances are for. They're gathering sacrifices." Evan's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't want to believe any of this, but the evidence was stacking up. The symbols he'd seen at the crime scenes, the strange abilities manifesting within him, the eerie silence that followed any mention of the spider god. It was all too real. "How do I stop it?" he asked, his voice low. The widow's expression darkened. "You may not be able to. The cult is powerful, and they're already deep into the summoning process. But there is one way, a broken bar." She trailed off, and Evan's gaze snapped up to her. "One way what?" She hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "If you can find the heart of the ritual, the place where they plan to bring the spider god into this world, you might be able to disrupt it. But it won't be easy. They'll be expecting you." Evan stood, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "Where is it?" The widow handed him a small map, marked with strange, spiraling lines that led to a point deep within the city. "Here, beneath the city's central core. It's been hidden for centuries, but I've managed to piece together the location. If you're going to stop them, you need to go now." The ritual is said to happen tonight. Without another word, Evan turned and left the warehouse, the map clenched tightly in his hand. The streets seemed darker than usual, the neon lights casting twisted shadows as he made his way toward the city's central core. His mind raced as he tried to prepare himself for what was coming. He was walking into the heart of the cult, straight into their lair, and he didn't know what he would find once he got there. But one thing was clear: if he didn't stop the ritual, the city, and possibly the world, would be lost. As he approached the location marked on the map, he found himself standing in front of an old, decrepit building that looked like it had been abandoned for decades. The windows were boarded up, and the walls were covered in graffiti. But Evan could feel something broken by wrong about the place. There was an energy in the air, something dark and ancient lurking just beneath the surface. He pushed open the door, stepping into the building's dimly lit interior. Dust floated through the air, and the floorboards creaked beneath his feet. The place looked abandoned, but Evan knew better. He could feel eyes watching him from the shadows. The map led him deeper into the building, down a set of narrow stairs that descended into the earth. The air grew colder with each step, and the smell of damp stone filled his nostrils. His pulse quickened as he reached the bottom of the stairs and found himself standing in front of a massive metal door, its surface etched with the same spider symbols he had seen at the cathedral. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door open. Inside was a vast, underground chamber, its walls lined with flickering torches that cast eerie shadows across the floor. At the center of the room was a stone altar, and surrounding it were hooded figures, their faces hidden in the darkness. On the altar lay one of the missing people, bound and unconscious, while the cultists chanted in a language Evan didn't understand. The leader of the cult stood at the far end of the room, his hands raised in the air as he recited the final words of the ritual. Evan recognized him immediately as Scifiaudiobooks, the man who had been behind so many of the city's darkest dealings. He had always suspected Varn was involved in something bigger, but he never imagined this. Evan's body tensed as he prepared to confront the cultists, his hands trembling with the energy surging through him. He had no idea how to stop the ritual, but he knew he had to try. Slowly, He stepped forward, his presence unnoticed in the chaos of the chanting. But then, Vorn's eyes snapped open, locking onto Evan with a cold, calculating stare. "So, you finally arrived," Vorn said, his voice echoing through the chamber. "I was wondering when you would show up, Detective." Evan's fists clenched, webs forming between his fingers. "It ends here, Vorn." Vorn chuckled darkly. "You don't understand, do you? This isn't just a summoning. This is destiny. The Spider God will return, and you, Evan Locke, are the key to that return." Evan's mind raced. The key? What did that mean? Before he could process it, Vorn raised his hand, and the cultists began to move, their hoods falling back to reveal grotesque, spider-like faces. Their eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and their mouths clicked with the sound of mandibles. Evan didn't wait for them to attack. He leapt into action, his body moving with a speed and agility that still felt foreign to him. His webs shot out, wrapping around one of the cultists and yanking him off his feet. Another lunged at him, but Evan dodged, flipping over the creature and landing in a crouch. The battle was chaotic, the room filled with the sounds of webs snapping and fists connecting with flesh. But Evan wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting to stop the ritual, to save the city from whatever horror Vorn was trying to unleash. In the chaos, Evan noticed something at the altar. The chanting was centered around it, and he could feel the energy radiating from the stone. If he could destroy it, maybe he could disrupt the ritual. He fought his way through the cultists, his powers guiding him as he scaled the walls and swung across the chamber. With one final burst of strength, he landed on the altar, tearing at the stone with his webs. The energy pulsed beneath his fingers, and for a moment, he thought he had failed. But then, with a deafening crack, the altar shattered, sending a shock wave through the chamber. The cultists screamed as the ground beneath them trembled, their bodies disintegrating into dust as the ritual collapsed. Vorn, however, remained standing, his face twisted in rage. "You think this is over?" he spat. "The Spider God cannot be stopped. Not by you. Not by anyone." Evan didn't respond. He lunged at Vorn, webbing him to the wall before he could react. The cult leader struggled, but Evan's strength was too much. With a final surge of power, Evan tightened the webs, silencing Vorn once and for all. The chamber fell silent. Evan stood in the wreckage of the ritual, his body shaking from the effort. The cult was destroyed, the summoning stopped, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. He could still feel the power coursing through him, the webs clinging to his skin. As he left the underground lair and stepped back into the cold night air, Evan knew that the battle wasn't truly over. The city was safe for now, but the Spider God's influence still lingered in the shadows, and his powers, once dormant, were now awake. He looked down at his hands, the webs still glistening between his fingers. He was no longer just a detective. He was something more, something dangerous, and the city still needed him.